Britain gave the world Shakespeare, the Beatles, and afternoon tea. But behind that polished, civilized image is a history soaked in blood, rot, plague, executions, and enough stomach-turning behavior to make even the most hardened historian put down their biscuit. From medieval torture chambers to Victorian sewers running beneath the feet of oblivious pedestrians, the story of Britain is not quite what your school textbooks told you. These are 101 nasty British history facts that will make your skin crawl. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Fact number 1. The streets of medieval London were not paved with gold. They were paved with filth. Butchers, fishmongers, and tanners all operated openly in the streets, and their waste, their blood, their offal, and their rotting scraps were simply thrown directly into the road. The smell was reportedly so overwhelming that visitors from continental Europe noted it the moment they arrived by ship on the Thames. The city had open sewers called kennels running down the centre of each street, and Londoners were technically supposed to keep the section in front of their homes clean. Almost nobody did. Rats thrived in the gutters and bred in the rubbish heaps that accumulated in corners and doorways. Disease flourished in the warm months when decomposition was fastest and the smell was at its worst. Flies were everywhere. The people who grew up in it simply could not smell what visitors from cleaner places found unbearable the moment they arrived, and the people who lived there simply accepted it as the smell of ordinary life, because there was no other kind of life available to them. Visitors from the countryside found it shocking. People born in London found it unremarkable. The nose adapts, which is perhaps one of the more disturbing things about human beings. Fact number 2. In the 14th century, the Black Death arrived in Britain and killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. That is millions of people dead within a few years. Villages were wiped out so completely that the grass grew over the streets and the buildings rotted quietly back into the earth without anyone left to notice. Fields went unfarmed. Livestock wandered ownerless across the countryside because there was no one left to pen them or feed them or care whether they lived or died. No mass graves were dug outside town walls because there were simply too many dead bodies to bury individually, and the usual rituals of burial and mourning could not be maintained when people were dying at such an extraordinary rate. The psychological impact on survivors was shattering in ways that took generations to process. People genuinely believed the world was ending, that God had abandoned them, and that nothing they did mattered anymore. Some turned to extreme religious penance, flagellating themselves in public processions, covering themselves in ash, living in voluntary poverty and misery. Others turned to extreme hedonism, drinking everything, spending everything, loving anyone they could, because tomorrow they might also be dead. Both responses made a disturbing kind of sense given the horror they were living through, and the social structures that held medieval society together cracked under the pressure of a catastrophe that respected none of them and that no institution had any answer to. Fact number 3. Medieval doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humours. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The treatment for most conditions was bloodletting, where a vein was opened and blood drained until the patient either improved or, rather more frequently, collapsed from blood loss on top of whatever they already had. Leeches were applied to the skin regularly and in large numbers, sometimes dozens at a time. Enemas were administered constantly for conditions that had nothing obviously to do with the digestive system. Patients suffering from fevers were sometimes buried up to their necks in cold earth to bring the temperature down. People with epilepsy were given treatments involving wearing amulets made from bones of saints or consuming preparations made from human skulls. People with mental illness were sometimes dunked in water, beaten with branches, or subjected to sustained loud noises in an attempt to drive out the demons supposedly residing inside them. Medicine, for most of British history, made people measurably worse rather than better, and the patients who survived medieval treatment often did so in spite of their physicians rather than because of them. There was no licensing, there was no formal training as we would recognize it. Anyone could call themselves a physician. The results were predictable. Fact number 4. Tower of London. Prisoners were not treated uniformly, and the experience of imprisonment there could range from relatively tolerable to genuinely nightmarish, depending entirely on how wealthy you were and who you knew outside the walls. Rich prisoners could pay for better rooms, better food, permission for their servants to attend them, permission to have books and writing materials, and even permission to walk on the tower grounds during daylight hours. Some wealthy prisoners essentially lived in something resembling uncomfortable house arrest inside the tower, maintaining a degree of dignity and comfort that the building's reputation does not suggest. Poor prisoners were shoved into damp stone cells with no ventilation, no heating, minimal food, and whatever vermin decided to share the space. And some prisoners spent years in the tower without trial, forgotten by everyone who had once cared about their fate. Some went genuinely mad in the darkness and isolation. Some died of conditions that would have been entirely preventable under different circumstances. Fact number 5. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was accused of adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother, and of plotting to murder the king. Modern historians are almost uniformly agreed that none of these charges were true, and that the accusations were fabricated to provide legal cover for Henry's desire to be rid of her after she failed to produce a male heir and he had become interested in someone else. She was arrested in May 1536 and executed 19 days later, and a speed that reflects how little the process was concerned with establishing actual guilt. At her execution on Tower Green, a skilled French swordsman was imported specifically to remove her head, because it was considered more merciful than an axe, and because Henry apparently felt this was the least he could offer. Witnesses reported that her lips were still moving after the head was separated from her body. Whether this was involuntary muscle movement or something more has been debated by historians and physicians ever since, and no one has provided a definitively satisfying answer. Her body was buried beneath the chapel floor inside the tower, without a coffin, in a simple elm chest that had once held arrows. No ceremony, no monument. Fact number 6. Henry VIII executed 2 of his 6 wives, had 2 marriages annulled, and 1 wife died in childbirth, and only 1 outlived him. He also executed around 70,000 people during his reign, depending on which historian's estimate you use and how broadly you define the term his reign. This included close friends of many years' standing, trusted advisors who had served him faithfully, archbishops who had given him counsel, and anyone else he decided was inconvenient or threatening. Thomas More had been his friend, his Lord Chancellor, a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts, and was beheaded after refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the Church of England. Thomas Cromwell had served Henry with extraordinary efficiency for years, had helped engineer the dissolution of the monasteries that filled the royal treasury, and was executed after having the profound misfortune to arrange a marriage to a woman Henry found unattractive. Henry described his new bride, Anne of Cleves, as a Flemish mare and had Cromwell's head for the mistake. The pattern is consistent throughout Henry's reign. People who served him well rose high and then fell short of his expectations in any way, however minor, faced consequences that bore no relationship to the scale of their failure. Power in Henry's England was not simply uncertain. Fact number 7. Public executions in Britain were treated as entertainment for centuries, and the crowds that gathered to watch them were enormous, enthusiastic, and expected to be there. For centuries, crowds gathered in their tens of thousands to watch hangings, beheadings, and burnings at the stake in the main public squares and execution grounds of British cities. Street vendors sold food and drink. Children were given the day off school. The best viewing spots near the scaffold commanded premium prices from those willing to pay for a closer look, and scaffolding was sometimes erected specifically to provide elevated positions for wealthy spectators. Pickpockets worked the crowds enthusiastically and productively, the execution crowd being among the more target-rich environments available to a skilled thief. When the condemned was a famous or particularly notorious figure, the turnout could be truly extraordinary. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 drew a massive crowd that let out a collective groan when the axe fell, in a sound that witnesses described as unlike anything they had ever heard before or since. A sound they struggled to describe in words because it was made up of so many individual voices expressing the same involuntary response simultaneously. Fact number 8. Pressing to death, known formally as peine forte et dure, was a legal torture used in England for several centuries and applied specifically to defendants who refused to enter a plea in court. Without a plea, a trial could not legally proceed, and without a trial, a conviction was impossible, which meant the authorities had no mechanism to punish someone who simply refused to speak. The solution was to apply pressure until they either agreed to engage with the legal process or died. The defendant was laid on their back on the floor of the prison, and a heavy wooden board was placed on their chest, and weights were added to the board, one by one, over a period of days. The defendant was given minimal food and water during this process. Pressing continued until they either agreed to enter a plea, confessed outright, or died under the accumulated weight. Some people chose death deliberately and knowingly, because dying without conviction meant their estate was not confiscated by the crown, whereas dying after a conviction meant their family inherited nothing. The calculation was rational and human and terrible. The last known case of pressing to death in England occurred in 1741, but the practice was not formally abolished until 1772. Fact number 9. The pillory was a wooden frame that locked a person's head and hands in a fixed position in a public square, where they were required to stand for a set period, usually several hours. People convicted of crimes like fraud, libel, perjury, or selling short measures were sentenced to the pillory as a form of public humiliation. The problem was that the crowd decided what the experience actually felt like, and the crowd's mood was entirely unpredictable. A sympathetic crowd might throw flowers or simply watch. A hostile crowd might throw stones, rotten vegetables, dead cats, offal from the nearby butcher's quarter, or human waste collected for the purpose. People died in the pillory from the injuries inflicted by hostile crowds. Others lost eyes to well-aimed projectiles. Others survived relatively unscathed. Whether a given session in the pillory became lethal or merely unpleasant depended entirely on local feelings about the person being punished and the general mood of the area on that particular day. Some people sentenced to the pillory were popular enough that the crowd celebrated them. Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, spent time in the pillory for a seditious pamphlet and reportedly had flowers thrown at him, rather than stones. Fact number 10. Body snatching was a booming criminal industry in 18th and 19th century Britain, driven by an entirely legitimate need and an entirely inadequate legal response to it. Medical schools needed cadavers for anatomy training because the science of surgery was advancing rapidly, and surgeons trained on human bodies learned skills that could not be replicated on anything else. But the legal supply of corpses was extremely limited. Only the bodies of executed murderers could legally be dissected, and there were not nearly enough executed murderers to meet the demand of the growing number of medical schools and their students. So a criminal enterprise emerged to fill the gap. Gangs called resurrection men, or body snatchers, would descend on newly filled graves, usually working at night, and remove the body before the earth had fully settled. They would sell the corpse to medical schools for substantial sums, and the surgeons who received the bodies asked absolutely no questions and paid without hesitation. Families responded by fitting graves with heavy iron cages called mort safes to protect the occupants. Churches built watchtowers from which volunteers guarded the graveyard for the first weeks after a burial, until the body decomposed sufficiently to be of no value for dissection. Families sat vigil in all weathers. Fact number 11. Burke and Hare took the body-snatching trade one horrifying step further and created what is arguably the most disturbing criminal partnership in British history. Operating in Edinburgh in 1828, they discovered that it was considerably easier and far more profitable to create fresh bodies than to dig them up, which was laborious and unpredictable. Over the course of roughly a year, they murdered at least 16 people, possibly more, by a method of suffocation they developed specifically for the purpose. Holding the victim's nose and mouth while pressing on the chest, a technique that left no obvious external marks on the body. They sold the corpses to the anatomist Robert Knox, a celebrated lecturer who attracted enormous student audiences and whose demand for fresh teaching material was essentially unlimited. Knox asked no questions. Knox paid on delivery. Burke and Hare's victims were mostly poor people living on the margins of Edinburgh society, lodgers at their boarding house who had no family to notice them missing, elderly residents of the city's poorest neighborhoods, people nobody would miss immediately or would miss loudly enough to be heard. When they were finally caught, Burke was convicted and hanged, and his body was publicly dissected in front of 500 spectators, a grim irony that every newspaper in Edinburgh noted with satisfaction. Fact number 12. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 was not simply a religious event. It was one of the largest and most rapid transfers of property in English history, carried out over a few years and affecting hundreds of institutions that had accumulated land, wealth, and an influence over centuries. Hundreds of religious houses were closed, their treasuries seized by the Crown, their lands redistributed to Henry's political allies and supporters, and in many cases, their buildings stripped of anything valuable and then abandoned to the weather. Monks and nuns were turned out into a country that had no welfare system to support displaced people and no mechanism to absorb them into ordinary economic life. Some received small pensions. Many ended up genuinely destitute. The libraries that monasteries had accumulated over generations were destroyed with breathtaking carelessness. The illuminated manuscripts that had taken skilled monks' lifetimes to create were scattered, sold as scrap parchment to binders and grocers, or simply burned when no buyer could be found. The scholar, John Leland, appointed by Henry to catalogue monastic libraries before dissolution, was so horrified by what he saw happening to the books that he went mad, or at least that is the story that has come down to us, which may be apocryphal but feels emotionally plausible given what was lost. Fact number 13. Witch trials in Britain were a recurring feature of life from the medieval period right through to the early 18th century, with the most intense period of prosecution running from roughly 1560 to 1680, during which thousands of people were accused, hundreds tried, and around 500 executed. The primary method of execution in England was hanging rather than burning, which is a distinction that matters rather less than it might seem when you are the one being executed. Accusations often emerge from neighbours during times of community stress, such as drought, failed harvests, unexplained illness in livestock, or sudden deaths of children that had no available medical explanation. The accused were overwhelmingly elderly women, widows, and those who lived on the edges of their communities without family protection. The Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, was a lawyer who operated in East Anglia in the 1640s during the chaos of the English Civil War and was personally responsible for the deaths of perhaps 300 people in just a few years, more than were executed for witchcraft in the previous century in England. He used methods including swimming the accused, keeping them awake for days until they confessed to anything, and pricking their skin to find the supposedly insensate devil's mark. Fact number 14. Scottish witch trials were considerably more intense and more deadly than those in England, and Scotland executed proportionally far more people for witchcraft than almost anywhere else in Europe over the relevant period. The North Berwick witch trials of the 1590s resulted in dozens of executions and reportedly attracted the personal involvement of King James VI of Scotland, who interrogated some of the accused himself and became so fascinated by the subject that he later wrote a book about witchcraft called Daemonologie. When James became James I of England in 1603, and he brought his obsession with witchcraft south with him, which influenced the legal and cultural climate around witch prosecution for decades. Torture was routinely used in Scotland to extract confessions, including prolonged sleep deprivation that could last days, the strappado in which the accused was suspended by their arms tied behind their back, the crushing of fingers and legs using devices that shattered bones, and the burning of the soles of the feet. Confessions obtained under these conditions invariably named other people as co-conspirators, and those named people were then arrested and tortured until they named yet more people. Fact number 15. The Great Fire of London in September 1666 destroyed roughly 13,000 homes, 87 churches, the medieval Guildhall, and most of the buildings of the City of London, burning for 4 days in a fire that was visible from miles away and filled the sky with smoke, dense enough to be described as darkness at noon. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane on the 2nd of September and was initially dismissed as so small a fire as a woman might piss it out. By the time that assessment was recognized as catastrophically wrong, the fire had spread through the tightly packed, mostly wooden buildings of the medieval city with a speed that made organized firefighting almost impossible. Remarkably, official death records from the fire are very low, only a handful of named victims, but historians have long suspected the true number of deaths was much higher than the records suggest, and partly because the poor and the homeless left no paper trail that would record their deaths, and partly because extreme heat can cremate a human body entirely, leaving no identifiable bones to count or record. The fire had a terrible silver lining. It burned through the crowded, rat-infested, plague-ridden wooden buildings of the medieval city and replaced them, eventually, with wider streets and brick construction that was both less combustible and less hospitable to the rats that carried plague. Fact number 16. The Irish potato famine from 1845 to 1852 killed approximately 1 million people and drove another million to emigrate in conditions of desperation and suffering that were described by those who witnessed them as unlike anything they had seen outside of a wartime battlefield. What is essential to understand about the famine is that it was not simply a natural disaster that exceeded Britain's capacity to respond. Food continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain throughout much of the famine period. Ireland continued to produce grain, livestock, and other foodstuffs in quantities that could have made a significant difference to the death toll if they had been retained or redirected rather than exported. The British government's response was shaped not primarily by the practical question of how to save lives, but by ideological commitments to free market economics and by a widespread belief among the ruling class that the famine was a natural and perhaps even divinely ordained correction to Irish overpopulation, or perhaps punishment for Irish Catholicism. Relief was slow, inadequate, and frequently attached to conditions that made it degrading or practically inaccessible to the most desperate and consistently underfunded relative to the scale of the catastrophe. Fact number 17. Transportation to Australia began in 1788 as a solution to a very practical British domestic problem, which was that the prisons were full and getting fuller. Britain had been using decommissioned ships moored in rivers and harbours as overflow prisons, and conditions on these hulks were so catastrophically bad that they were killing people at a disturbing rate from disease and violence. Transportation offered a way to empty British prisons while simultaneously establishing a colonial presence in a land recently claimed for the Crown and in need of a labour force to begin the work of building a colony. Over roughly 80 years of the transportation era, approximately 160,000 convicts were transported to Australia. The offences that could trigger transportation included theft of goods worth more than a shilling, which in practice meant almost any theft at all, as well as poaching, forgery, vagrancy in certain circumstances, and a vast range of other criminal behaviours that today would result at most in a fine or a short period of community service. Fact number 18. The convict ships that carried prisoners to Australia were floating nightmares during the early decades of transportation, before reform and public scandal forced improvements to the conditions. Men were kept below decks in irons for much of the voyage, which could last anywhere from 4 to 8 months, depending on the weather, the route, and the competence of the captain. Disease spread through the crowded holds with devastating speed, because the conditions were ideal for transmission of almost every communicable illness available. Dysentery was the constant companion of every voyage. Typhus came and went, depending on the infestation of lice. Scurvy appeared when provisions ran short or were of poor quality. In the early years of transportation, mortality rates on some voyages were catastrophic by any measure. The Neptune arrived in New South Wales in June 1790 with 499 convicts aboard. By the time she arrived, 158 of them had died at sea, and a significant proportion of the survivors were so ill they could not walk down the gangplank and had to be carried or dragged ashore, and the resulting scandal prompted reform of the contracts under which transportation ships were hired and the conditions they were required to provide. Fact number 19. The British penal colonies in Australia were not uniform in their brutality, but the most severe of them were extraordinarily brutal by any standard one might care to apply. Port Arthur in Van Diemen's Land, now the island of Tasmania, operated a system of secondary punishment for convicts who reoffended while already serving a transportation sentence. Men who had already been sent to the end of the world and then managed to make things worse for themselves. Flogging was the routine response to infractions and was administered in public in front of assembled convicts. And solitary confinement was extended for weeks or months at a time in small stone cells that were nearly entirely dark. The model prison, completed at Port Arthur in 1848, operated on the separate system, the same philosophy that governed Britain's model prison at Pentonville. Prisoners were kept in absolute silence at all times, and when they were moved through the facility for any purpose, they were required to wear brown hoods with small eye slits so they could see where they were going, but could not see or be recognized by other prisoners. Prolonged isolation, combined with the sensory deprivation of the hood system, drove many prisoners to genuine madness in measurable and documented ways. Fact number 20. The conditions faced by First Nations Australians under British colonial rule constitute one of history's most sustained and devastating episodes of dispossession. And this belongs squarely in a history of Britain, because it was Britain that sent the ships, planted the flag, and established the legal and social frameworks that made what followed possible. The legal fiction of terra nullius, the idea that Australia was effectively empty and ownerless land available for claiming, was used to justify the seizure of territory that had been inhabited, known, and cared for by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for roughly 60,000 years, by far the longest continuous human occupation of any territory on Earth. Massacres of Aboriginal communities occurred from the earliest years of settlement and continued into the 20th century in a pattern of frontier violence that was systematically undercounted, underreported, and then subsequently minimized and denied by the historical record for generations. Children were removed from their families as part of official government policy for much of the 20th century, a practice known in its effects as the stolen generations, which separated tens of thousands of children from their parents, their communities, their languages, and their cultures in an explicit government attempt to eliminate Aboriginal identity by breaking the chain of transmission between generations. Fact number 21. The British Empire at its peak covered roughly 1/4 of the Earth's total land surface and governed roughly 1/4 of the world's total population, making it the largest empire in recorded human history by those measures. It was also sustained by extraordinary levels of violence, exploitation, and coercion that the people who benefited from it were often remarkably frank about among themselves. Whatever they chose to say publicly about civilizing missions and the responsibilities of empire. Famines that killed millions of people occurred under British colonial rule in India and Ireland and elsewhere, often in circumstances where British policy either directly caused the conditions that produced the famine or actively prevented adequate relief from reaching the dying. The extraction of resources and labor from colonized territories enriched Britain and the class of people who owned shares in colonial enterprises, while impoverishing the people who actually lived on those territories and produced that wealth. Fact number 22. The British East India Company was one of the most remarkable and in many ways most alarming institutions in the history of commerce. It was not a government department, not a state agency, not a branch of the Crown. It was a private joint stock trading company, owned by shareholders seeking profit, that at its peak maintained its own standing army that was larger than the British Army itself, administered its own territories across a subcontinent, collected its own taxes from millions of people, operated its own judiciary that tried and sentenced its subjects, and conducted its own wars and foreign policy independently of the British Parliament. The company's pursuit of profit was relentless, systematic, and frequently brutal in ways that even contemporaries found disturbing once the evidence became impossible to ignore. The Bengal famine of 1770, which killed somewhere between 10 and 15 million people out of a total Bengal population of approximately 30 million, occurred during a period of company rule and was significantly worsened by company policies that included continuing to collect taxes from a population that was starving to death. Fact number 23. The British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade lasted from the mid-16th century until 1807, when the trade itself was finally abolished after decades of campaigning by abolitionists, for many of them Quakers and evangelical Christians. During that period, British ships transported approximately 3.5 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the Americas, with British merchants and investors profiting at every stage of the process. The Middle Passage, the crossing from the African coast to the Americas, was conducted in conditions of deliberate dehumanization, designed to maximize the number of people transported per voyage and minimize the costs of doing so. Enslaved people were packed into ships in spaces so tight they could not sit upright, lying in rows on shelving with perhaps 18 inches of clearance above them. Disease spread through the holds continuously, and mortality on individual voyages could be catastrophic. When slavery in British territories was finally abolished by the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, the compensation question was resolved in a way that reveals, with particular clarity, how the system was understood by those who ran it. The enslaved people received nothing. The slave owners received £20 million from the British government in compensation for the loss of their property. The government took out a loan to pay this compensation. Fact number 24. The Amritsar massacre of April 1919 took place when British Indian Army soldiers, under the command of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, opened fire on a peaceful crowd that had gathered in an enclosed public garden called Jallianwala Bagh in the city of Amritsar in Punjab. Dyer arrived at the garden with 90 soldiers, positioned them at the single main entrance, and ordered them to fire without warning into the crowd, which had gathered to celebrate a Hindu festival and had no way of knowing that a recently enacted law prohibited public gatherings. The garden was surrounded by walls on most sides, and the main entrance was now blocked by soldiers, leaving the crowd, essentially, no way to escape. Soldiers fired for approximately 10 minutes and used approximately 1,650 rounds. Between 300 and 1,000 people were killed, depending on whose count you accept, and approximately 1,000 more were wounded. Dyer later stated in a formal inquiry that he had wanted to produce a sufficient moral effect on the province, and showed no remorse for the deaths whatsoever. He was removed from his command, but never prosecuted for the massacre. Fact number 25. The workhouse system, established under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, was designed with deliberate and stated intent to be unpleasant. The architects of the system were followers of utilitarian economics and held a theory called less eligibility, which required that conditions inside the workhouse always be worse than the very worst conditions available to any independent labourer outside it. If the workhouse were comfortable, the theory went, people who could support themselves would prefer it to working, and this would be both economically damaging and morally corrupting to the poor. So the workhouse was made deliberately miserable. Families were separated on entry. Men, women, children, and the elderly were housed in separate wings and strictly forbidden from seeing or communicating with each other, meaning that a husband and wife who entered the workhouse together might not see each other again for months or years. Work was pointless and designed specifically to be exhausting and degrading. Oakum picking involved shredding old tarry rope by hand until the fingers bled and the skin cracked. Stone breaking involved sitting outdoors, breaking rocks into smaller rocks for hours at a stretch. The treadmill, where installed, involved walking on a rotating drum for hours to power machinery or simply to turn. Food was minimal, monotonous, deliberately unappealing, and served in silence at long, communal tables under conditions that stripped the act of eating of any of its social or human dimensions. The workhouse was not a safety net. Fact number 26. Child labour was standard and unremarkable practice in Britain from the earliest days of industrialisation through to the gradual legislative reforms of the 19th century. Children, as young as 5 or 6 years old, worked in coal mines in conditions that were dangerous in ways that nobody who designed those conditions showed much concern about. The youngest children worked as trappers, sitting in total darkness for 12 hours a day beside ventilation doors that they opened and shut whenever a coal cart needed to pass. A job so tedious and so isolated that children sometimes fell asleep at their posts. Slightly older children worked as hurriers, pushing or pulling heavy coal carts through passages too narrow and too low for adults. Children worked in textile mills operating machinery that removed fingers, hands, and arms with mechanical regularity. Children in the early years of the coal gas industry entered pipes to clean them. Children worked in brickyards and potteries and match factories, where the phosphorus used to make matches caused a disease called phossy jaw, in which the jawbone rotted from the inside out, glowed greenish in the dark, and produced a smell that witnesses described as impossible to forget. Fact number 27. The Peterloo Massacre of August 1819 occurred when a crowd estimated at somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people gathered peacefully at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to hear speeches calling for parliamentary reform. The political context was one of intense pressure. Britain was governed by a parliamentary system that left most adult men and all women without any votes at all, and large industrial cities like Manchester, which had grown enormously during the Industrial Revolution and contained hundreds of thousands of people, had literally no representation in Parliament whatsoever, while tiny, depopulated constituencies with a handful of voters returned 2 members each. The crowd was peaceful, organised, and had been drilling specifically to present themselves as orderly and respectable. Local magistrates, watching from a window nearby and apparently terrified by the sheer size of the assembly, ordered the local yeomanry cavalry to ride into the crowd and arrest the speakers on the platform. The yeomanry were part-time soldiers, poorly trained and apparently frightened themselves, and what began as an attempt at a targeted arrest became a cavalry charge into a dense crowd. At least 15 people were killed, and somewhere between 400 and 700 were injured by saber cuts and trampling. Fact number 28. Newgate Prison in London was in continuous operation from the 12th century until 1902, and for most of that extraordinary span of time, it was a place of misery that contemporaries across the social spectrum recognized as an appalling human environment. Overcrowding was so chronic that the term overcrowding becomes almost meaningless. Prisoners were packed into spaces designed for a fraction of their actual number. Disease moved through the prison population constantly because in an enclosed space with no sanitation, inadequate ventilation, minimal food, and hundreds of sick people, breathing the same recirculated air, disease was essentially impossible to prevent. Prison fever, identified retrospectively as most likely typhus, swept through Newgate repeatedly and killed prisoners and guards alike with similar indifference. In 1750, in an event known as the Black Assize, a typhus outbreak originating in Newgate spread to the Old Bailey courthouse during a session of the court and killed the judge, 2 members of the jury, several lawyers, and a significant number of bystanders who had come to observe proceedings. Fact number 29. Public hangings at Tyburn, located at what is now Marble Arch in the West End of London, were major public events for several centuries and drew crowds that could number in the tens of thousands for particularly famous condemned criminals. The site had a permanent triangular gallows called the Tyburn Tree, constructed to allow multiple simultaneous executions, and the logistics of execution day were elaborate and community-involving in ways that are difficult to imagine from the perspective of the present. The condemned were driven in a cart from Newgate Prison through the streets of London to Tyburn, a journey that took approximately 2 hours through streets lined with spectators. Along the route, it was traditional for the cart to stop at various taverns so the condemned could drink, a custom that contributed to the expression having one for the road still used today. Scaffolding was erected around the gallows for spectators who could pay for elevated views. Street vendors sold printed accounts of the condemned person's crimes and last confession, real or invented. When the hanging finally happened, and death came from slow strangulation rather than the quick drop and broken neck of later practice, and it was common for friends or family members of the condemned to be positioned below the gallows to pull on the legs and thereby shorten the dying. Fact number 30. The Cato Street Conspiracy of 1820 was a plot by a group of radical reformers to assassinate the entire British cabinet at a dinner, seize control of key institutions in London, display the severed heads of prominent ministers on poles in the street, and thereby trigger a popular uprising against the government. The plan was both ambitious and catastrophically compromised. A government spy named George Edwards had embedded himself deeply in the conspiracy and was providing detailed intelligence to the authorities throughout the planning period. When the conspirators assembled in a loft above a stable in Cato Street, Marylebone, on the evening of February 23rd, in 1820, police and soldiers were waiting for them. In the resulting confrontation, one policeman was killed with a sword and several conspirators escaped, though all the principal leaders were eventually arrested. 5 of the ringleaders were sentenced to be hanged and then beheaded, the last time this sentence was carried out in English legal history. The beheading was performed after hanging by a masked man, using a surgical knife rather than an axe, and the head of each man was held up to the crowd by the hair and announced to be the head of a traitor. Fact number 31. The Bedlam Asylum, formerly known as the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, was the oldest psychiatric institution in the world, and for much of its long history was a horror that managed to combine genuine medical incompetence with a kind of casual public cruelty that is difficult to process from the standpoint of the present. From the 17th through to the early 19th century, paying members of the public could enter Bedlam and observe the patients for an admission fee of 1 penny, the same price as a glass of gin. The inmates were effectively exhibits in a museum of madness, and wealthy Londoners would visit on Sunday afternoons as casually and with as much emotional engagement as they might visit a zoo. Patients were chained to walls in postures they could not change for hours. They were kept in conditions of profound filth. They were subjected to treatments that included being strapped into rotating chairs that spun at speed until the patient vomited, being plunged repeatedly into cold baths, being bled, being purged with powerful laxatives, being blistered with hot irons applied to the skin to draw out the presumed corruption, and being beaten by attendants who had no training and who exercised their authority with minimal oversight. Fact number 32. The Wars of the Roses, fought between 1455 and 1487, were a series of civil wars between 2 branches of the royal house of Plantagenet competing for the throne of England. The violence was extraordinary in scale and in its social consequences, destroying the lives of noble families across generations and fundamentally restructuring the English aristocracy in ways that created the political landscape into which the Tudor dynasty was eventually born. The battles were often brutal and decisive, and the treatment of defeated nobles was rarely merciful, with execution, attainder stripping heirs of their inheritance, and exile being the common outcomes for those on the losing side. The Battle of Towton in March 1461 is described by historians as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. It was fought in a snowstorm in Yorkshire between forces that each numbered in the tens of thousands, and it resulted in somewhere between 28,000 and 38,000 deaths in a single day of fighting. The snow turned red and then pink as it melted. Bodies were stripped by local people looking for usable clothing and equipment. Fact number 33. Leprosy was present in Britain from roughly the 4th century through to the 16th century, and British society's response to leprosy sufferers was one of the more formally organized and bureaucratically complete acts of exclusion in pre-modern European history. Leper colonies called leper houses, or lazarettos, were established outside town boundaries in large numbers, with estimates suggesting over 300 such institutions in medieval England. People diagnosed with leprosy were subjected to a church ceremony called the separation or the Mass for the Living Dead, in which they were treated as legally, socially, and spiritually deceased. They were forbidden from entering churches, markets, mills, bakeries, taverns, and ordinary homes. They were required to wear distinctive clothing that marked them as lepers and to carry a bell or a clapper to warn of their approach so that healthy people could move away before contact was possible. They could not eat or drink from shared vessels. They could not wash in public water sources. They could not use narrow bridges where passing might require contact. Fact number 34. The medieval English legal concept of the hue and cry required that any person who witnessed a crime being committed or a criminal actively fleeing was legally obligated to join in the pursuit and make as much noise as possible to alert the wider neighborhood that a chase was in progress. This was not a suggestion. It was a legal requirement, And failure to join the hue and cry when physically capable of doing so was itself a criminal offence punishable by fine. The rationale was sensible enough. Medieval England had no professional police force, no centralised system for pursuing criminals, and no reliable means of communication beyond the human voice. The hue and cry was therefore the community's substitute for all of these things, a mechanism by which the whole neighbourhood became temporarily deputized to pursue whoever had offended against its laws. The problem was that a crowd in full cry after a suspected criminal was not always entirely sure what the suspect had done, or even in some cases, whether they had the right person at all. Fact number 35. The sweating sickness was a mysterious and terrifying disease that struck England 5 times between 1485 and 1551, and then disappeared so completely that it has never been definitively identified with any known illness and has not been seen anywhere in the world since its last appearance. It killed with extraordinary speed. A person could feel perfectly well in the morning and be dead by evening of the same day, a rapidity of death that contemporary sources describe with a sense of bewilderment that survives 5 centuries. The symptoms began with a sense of apprehension and malaise, followed by cold shivering, then sudden intense sweating accompanied by heart palpitations, delirium, and rapid collapse. Unlike the Black Death, which struck the poor most heavily, the sweating sickness seemed to strike the wealthy and well-nourished as readily as the hungry and the destitute, which made it especially alarming to the ruling class, who were accustomed to disease as something that happened primarily to people who lived in squalor. It swept through the court of Henry VIII on multiple occasions, killing courtiers who had been in apparently perfect health the previous morning and causing Henry himself to flee London in terror on several occasions. What it was, what caused it, and why it vanished as suddenly and completely as it had appeared remained genuinely and profoundly unknown. Fact number 36. At Debtors' Prison was a real and widely operating institution in Britain, and it functioned on a circular logic so completely self-defeating that it seems almost to have been designed as cruelty rather than as any practical solution to any real problem. If you owed money and could not pay, you were sent to prison. While you were in prison, you obviously could not work. Because you could not work, you could not earn money. Because you could not earn money, you could not pay your debt. Because you could not pay your debt, you remained in prison. The length of imprisonment was theoretically indefinite, continuing until the debt was paid by you or by your family, until the creditor decided for whatever reason to release you, or until you died. Families sometimes moved into debtors' prisons alongside the imprisoned person, though because they had nowhere else to go and the imprisoned person needed care, which is how children grew up inside prison walls. The Marshalsea Prison in Southwark was one of the most famous debtors' prisons in London. Charles Dickens's father, John Dickens, was imprisoned there for debt when Charles was 12 years old, and the experience of visiting his father in the Marshalsea while working in a blacking factory to support the family shaped the young Dickens so profoundly that it echoes throughout his entire body of work. Fact number 37. The gin craze of the early 18th century was a genuine and serious public health catastrophe that killed thousands of Londoners and contributed to a measurable decline in the city's population at a time when most European cities were growing. When William of Orange came to the English throne in 1689, he reduced taxes on domestically produced grain spirits to undermine the import trade in French brandy, a measure driven by the Anglo-French economic and political hostility of the period. The unintended consequence was that gin became extraordinarily cheap and extraordinarily widely available in ways that nobody had planned for or anticipated. By the 1730s, there were estimated to be 7,000 gin shops in London alone, one for roughly every 10 households. Gin consumption per head of population reached levels that are difficult to comprehend from the standpoint of the present. Gin was drunk by adults at breakfast. It was drunk by children. It was given to babies to stop them crying. It was used as a painkiller and as an anesthetic and as a cure for almost everything. William Hogarth's famous engraving, Gin Lane, depicted the social consequences with documentary accuracy, showing mothers dropping babies, people pawning their belongings, bodies being loaded into coffins, and the general dissolution of neighborhood life in areas where gin consumption was heaviest. The mortality rate in London rose sharply. Deaths genuinely outpaced births for a period. The Gin Acts of 1736 and 1751 eventually reduced consumption through licensing and taxation, but the damage of the gin craze years was enormous. Fact number 38. The concept of a formal sewage system did not exist in British cities for most of their history, and the consequences of this absence played out repeatedly in waves of epidemic disease that killed hundreds of thousands of people over the centuries. Human waste was collected in cesspits beneath homes and emptied periodically by night soilmen who scooped it out by hand, loaded it onto carts, and sold it as agricultural fertilizer. When cesspits overflowed, which they regularly did in areas of dense population, the contents ran into the streets and from the streets into whatever watercourse was available. The Thames served as both London's primary source of drinking water and its primary sewer for centuries, a combination so obviously dangerous that it seems astonishing in retrospect that the connection between this arrangement and the periodic cholera epidemics that swept the city was not made much sooner. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames smelled so catastrophically badly during an unusually hot summer that Parliament could not function and the windows of the House of Commons had to be covered with lime-soaked curtains in an attempt to make the chamber habitable, finally forced the construction of a comprehensive sewer system for London under the engineer, Joseph Bazalgette. The cholera epidemics that had killed tens of thousands of Londoners in 1832, 1848 and 1854 did not recur after the sewers were completed. Fact number 39. The term lunatic derives from the medieval belief that madness was caused or exacerbated by the cycles of the moon, particularly the full moon, and this belief persisted in formal medical literature well into the modern period in ways that influenced how mentally ill people were treated for centuries. People showing signs of mental illness in medieval and early modern Britain were treated primarily as either spiritually afflicted and therefore in need of exorcism and religious intervention, or as physically dangerous and therefore in need of physical confinement and restraint. The chain and the cage were the standard practical tools of management. Families kept mentally ill. Relatives chained in back rooms or outbuildings for years and sometimes decades, neither expecting nor receiving any professional assistance. Villages sometimes kept a mentally ill community member in a kind of informal collective custody, with the community taking turns at supervision in arrangements that were as varied as the communities themselves. The transition from these informal arrangements to institutional care via purpose-built asylums in the 18th and 19th centuries was, in many cases, a transition from one form of confinement to another form of confinement, with the added dimension of total strangers administering treatments that included rotating chairs, prolonged cold baths, extended isolation, and various forms of physical restraint that were often demonstrably worse than the illness being treated. Fact number 40. Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England, has been one of history's most comprehensively vilified figures for centuries, and it is worth understanding that this reputation was created almost entirely by people who were employed by the dynasty that replaced him or who had powerful reasons to present the Tudor takeover as a rescue from tyranny. Shakespeare's portrait of Richard as a physically deformed, scheming, child-murdering monster was written during the reign of Elizabeth I, the granddaughter of Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard at Bosworth, and was written for audiences who had every political reason to be receptive to the blackest possible interpretation of the defeated king. Modern archaeology has complicated and challenged this picture significantly. When Richard's skeleton was discovered beneath a Leicester car park in 2012, it confirmed that he did have scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, and though not the hunchback or withered arm of Shakespeare's portrayal, it confirmed that he died at the Battle of Bosworth Field from multiple severe wounds. At least 11 blows were identified on the skeleton, and the final wounds appear to have been inflicted on the body after death in what forensic archaeologists describe as acts of deliberate humiliation. Whether Richard murdered the two young princes in the tower, who disappeared from history during his reign, remains genuinely contested and historically unresolved to this day. Fact number 41. The ducking stool was a device used primarily to punish women who were deemed scolding, quarrelsome, troublesome to their neighbours, or simply too loud and assertive for the community's comfort. The device consisted of a chair mounted on a long lever arm, positioned over a pond or river or a specially constructed pit of water, and the accused was strapped into the chair before being dunked repeatedly into the water below. The ducking was intended to be publicly humiliating rather than necessarily lethal, though people did die from the experience, from the shock of sudden cold immersion, from drowning when the operator was inattentive or malicious, or from the effects of hypothermia when the water was cold and the number of duckings was large. The frequency and number of duckings were determined by local magistrates with considerable discretion. 3 dunkings was a common sentence, but more were possible and were applied. The device was used well into the 18th century, and the last recorded use in England was in 1817, and meaning it was still in active use in living memory of people who would also have witnessed steam locomotives and the beginnings of industrial Britain. The coexistence of these two things says something important about how unevenly the past falls away. Fact number 42. Walter Raleigh, the Elizabethan explorer, courtier, privateer, and writer, was imprisoned in the Tower of London twice during his life under 2 different monarchs for 2 different reasons, and was eventually executed there in 1618 after a life that had moved between extraordinary favour and complete catastrophe, with a regularity that suggests either very bad luck or very poor judgment about the men he served. His first imprisonment, under James I, lasted 13 years, during which time he conducted scientific experiments, wrote poetry, and cultivated a herb garden on the tower's upper leads, and attempted to write a history of the world, an enormously ambitious project that he completed to about 1300 BC, before the pointlessness of the undertaking apparently overwhelmed him. He was released, sent on an expedition to South America in search of gold that failed disastrously and left many men dead, returned to England having failed in his mission, and was executed on a warrant that had technically been outstanding since his earlier conviction. His wife obtained his embalmed head after execution, and, according to accounts that are widely reported but not definitively verified, kept it with her for the remaining 29 years of her life, occasionally showing it to visitors. The head was eventually interred with their son when the son died years later. Fact number 43. The practice of drawing and quartering was the prescribed execution method for men convicted of high treason in England from the 13th century until the punishment was formally abolished in 1870, a remarkably long period of time for an execution method of this particular character to remain on the statute books. The condemned was first hanged by the neck but taken down before death, while still conscious and in considerable distress. He was then disemboweled, meaning his intestines were drawn out while he was still alive. He was then beheaded. The body was then cut into 4 quarters. Each of these parts was treated as a separate object to be disposed of as the authorities saw fit. Typically, the quarters were displayed publicly in prominent locations as a warning, sometimes boiled first to preserve them for longer display, and sent to different parts of the kingdom so that the maximum number of people in different areas would see the evidence of what happened to traitors. London Bridge was a particularly common display site for heads of executed traitors, and visitors approaching London from the south could look up and see the preserved heads of people who had been found guilty of betraying the crown. Women convicted of high treason were burned at the stake rather than subjected to this particular process, a distinction that was characterized at the time as mercy. Fact number 44. The enclosure movement, which accelerated significantly in the 18th and early 19th centuries, converted enormous areas of land that had previously been available for common use by the rural poor into privately owned property fenced off from public access. Millions of acres of common land, marshes, heaths, forests, and meadows on which ordinary people had for generations grazed their animals, gathered firewood, picked berries, cut peat, and supplemented their diets in 100 small ways that together constituted the margin between subsistence and starvation, were absorbed into the expanding estates of wealthy landowners who had the political connections to obtain private acts of parliament authorizing the enclosure. The displaced rural poor had nowhere to go but the industrial cities, which were growing rapidly and needed labor. And this is one of the mechanisms by which the Industrial Revolution obtained its workforce. The workforce it obtained was desperate, landless, without alternatives, and therefore willing to accept conditions of employment that a person with options would have refused. The connection between enclosure and the labor conditions of early industrial Britain is not coincidental. The dispossession that drove people off the land was the mechanism that made their labor available on terms that the factory owners required. Fact number 45. The Highland clearances in Scotland from roughly the 1750s through to the 1860s and beyond involved the systematic eviction of tenant farming communities from the Scottish Highlands to make way for large-scale sheep farming, which was far more profitable per acre than the traditional mixed agriculture of the clans that had occupied the land for generations. Families who had worked the same land for longer than anyone could remember were given extremely short notice to leave, sometimes days, sometimes just hours. Their homes were sometimes burned to prevent them from returning. Crops were destroyed, livestock was seized. The evicted communities were sometimes resettled on small coastal plots where they were expected to support themselves through kelp, harvesting, or fishing. But kelp prices collapsed. The fishing required equipment and knowledge that many displaced farming families did not have, and these coastal communities frequently found themselves in desperate poverty within a generation. Thousands emigrated to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, often on ships whose conditions rivaled the convict transports for overcrowding and disease mortality. The clearances depopulated landscapes that had sustained communities for thousands of years. They created the dramatically beautiful but largely empty highland scenery that later generations of tourists found romantic and that the people who had been removed from it found devastating. Fact number 46. The Pendle witch trials of 1612 in Lancashire resulted in the execution of 10 people and stand as one of the largest and best documented witch trials in English history. Remarkable not only for their scale, but for the specific and disturbing way in which the key evidence was gathered and used. The investigation began when a young woman named Alison Device begged a peddler for some pins, was refused, and the peddler subsequently suffered some kind of physical episode or fit that was attributed to her malice. From this beginning, a cascade of accusations developed as family members testified against each other, under the examination of the local magistrate Roger Nowell, who appears to have believed sincerely in what he was investigating. The key witness against the Device family, whose members formed the core of the accused, was a 9-year-old girl named Janet Device. Janet Device testified in open court against her own mother, Elizabeth, her brother James, and her sister Alison. She identified them as witches and described their alleged meetings and activities with the kind of detail that either reflects genuine knowledge or reflects the ability of a 9-year-old to understand what the adults around her wanted to hear. Her mother was hanged. Her brother was hanged. Her sister was hanged. And Janet Device herself was later accused of witchcraft in a separate trial in 1634, which speaks to something about the world she had been made to inhabit. Fact number 47. London's Great Plague of 1665 killed roughly 100,000 people, approximately 1/4 of the city's total population at that time, in a wave of disease that moved through the city during the summer months with a speed and completeness that left contemporaries struggling for words to describe what they were witnessing. The dead were collected from homes by carts that moved through the streets at night, their drivers ringing bells and calling for households to bring out their dead so the bodies could be loaded and taken away for burial. Mass burial pits were dug outside the city walls and filled with thousands of bodies in conditions of minimal ceremony, because ceremony required time and personnel, and both were overwhelmed by the scale of dying. Surviving records from parish registers document the death rate in figures that are almost incomprehensible. Thousands of deaths per week at the peak of the outbreak. Parishes that normally recorded perhaps 2 or 3 burials a week, recording dozens. The disease spread through fleas on rats, but nobody at the time understood this mechanism. Contemporaries identified cats and dogs as potential carriers, and the city's authorities ordered them killed, which may have actually worsened the epidemic by removing the natural predators of the rats that were genuinely responsible. The court fled London. The wealthy fled London. And those who could not afford to flee remained and faced it with whatever resources they had. Fact number 48. Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of Henry VIII, was married to him when she was approximately 16 or 17 years old, and Henry was 49, had been an invalid for several years following a severe jousting injury that had left him with a leg wound that never properly healed and caused him chronic pain, and had grown to a weight that contemporaries described tactfully as large. Catherine had almost certainly been sexually exploited as a young girl by her music teacher, Henry Manox, and quite possibly by others in the household of her grandmother, the Duchess of Norfolk, a large and poorly supervised establishment in which young people of the household lived in conditions of considerable social looseness that the Duchess apparently chose not to investigate too closely. Henry was charmed by Catherine's youth and energy at a court that had become quiet and sober under his previous wife, Anne of Cleves, whom he had found deeply unattractive. Catherine was executed in February 1542 at the approximate age of 19 for alleged adultery during the marriage with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper. There is no reliable historical evidence that the alleged adultery actually occurred, though Catherine's earlier history was real and was used against her. She was executed for political reasons in circumstances that bore no relationship to justice in any sense that the word has ever carried. Fact number 49. The Gordon riots of 1780 were a week of anti-Catholic violence in London, so severe and so widespread that they represented the most serious breakdown of civil order in the British capital between the English Civil War in the 1640s and the Blitz in the 1940s. The riots began as an organised march to Parliament to present a petition against the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, which had modestly relaxed some of the restrictions on Catholic religious practice and property ownership. What began as organised protest descended within hours into mob violence on an extraordinary scale as the crowd grew and the authorities proved completely incapable of managing it. Over the following days, Newgate Prison was stormed and set on fire, its prisoners freed into the streets. The Fleet Prison was attacked and burned. The King's Bench Prison was attacked. Yet the Bank of England was attacked and defended only by troops acting sovereign without clear legal authority to fire on British subjects. Numerous Catholic chapels were burned. The homes of Catholic individuals were looted and destroyed. Around 350 to 500 people were killed during the riots themselves, many of them rioters killed by troops or crushed in the chaos, and a further 25 ringleaders were subsequently tried and hanged. The chaos lasted 7 days before it was suppressed, and it left a significant portion of London in ruins. Fact number 50. The medieval ordeal was a method of legal proof that essentially asked God to produce the verdict on behalf of the court and trusted that divine justice would ensure the innocent were protected and the guilty were identified. And the ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a piece of iron that had been heated in a fire for a set distance, after which the hand was bandaged and inspected 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, this was taken as divine evidence of innocence. If it was infected, this was guilt confirmed by heaven. The ordeal of hot water required the accused to plunge a hand into boiling water and retrieve an object from the bottom of the vessel. The ordeal of cold water involved the accused being bound and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty, because pure water was believed to reject sinners. If they sank, they were innocent, with the assumption being that they would be pulled out before drowning, though the record suggests this did not always work as planned. The ordeals were supervised by priests, who blessed the water or the iron, and whose spiritual authority was supposed to ensure the mechanism worked correctly. The Fourth Lateran Council banned ordeals in 1215, removing clerical participation and thereby effectively ending the practice, after which trial by jury became the standard English mechanism of establishing guilt. Fact number 51. The English Civil War of the 1640s and the subsequent wars of the Three Kingdoms killed a higher proportion of the population of the British Isles than the First World War, when the total casualties across England, Scotland, and Ireland are calculated together and compared to the total population of the period. The execution of King Charles I in January 1649 was genuinely shocking to contemporaries across Europe and indeed across the world as news reached distant places. An anointed king, chosen by God to rule, was tried, convicted, and publicly beheaded by his own parliament, an act that seemed to contemporaries to violate the fundamental order of the universe. The Commonwealth period that followed, and then the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, governed Britain for 11 years with a combination of military efficiency and puritanical social legislation that made it deeply unpopular with large sections of the population who had not necessarily been royalists, but who found Cromwellian government limiting in ways they had not anticipated. Christmas celebrations were banned or heavily restricted. Theatres were closed. Horse racing was suppressed. Cockfighting and bear baiting were banned. When Cromwell died in 1658 and the Protectorate collapsed under his son Richard, the restoration of Charles II in 1660 was greeted with celebrations that contemporary accounts describe as the most intense, popular rejoicing the country had seen in living memory. Fact number 52. Oliver Cromwell died in September 1658 and was given a state funeral and buried with appropriate ceremony in Westminster Abbey alongside the kings he had displaced. He did not rest undisturbed. In January 1661, following the restoration of the monarchy, Parliament ordered that Cromwell and 2 other leading regicides who had died before the restoration could bring them to trial, be exhumed and subjected to a posthumous, symbolic execution. The bodies were dug up and subjected to a ceremony that replicated trial and conviction. They were then dragged on hurdles to Tyburn, the traditional place of execution, and where they were hanged in their burial shrouds for several hours. At the height, they would have been hanged had they been alive. After the hanging, the bodies were taken down and beheaded. Cromwell's head was placed on a spike on top of Westminster Hall, where it remained displayed for approximately 20 years before a storm blew it from its mounting. The head then passed through various private hands over the following decades, occasionally displayed as a curiosity to paying audiences, before eventually being interred in a secret location at Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge in 1960. The exact location within the college is known only to a very small number of people, deliberately kept secret to prevent the grave from being disturbed by those who might still have opinions about Cromwell. Fact number 53. The Tolpuddle Martyrs were 6 agricultural labourers from the Dorset village of Tolpuddle who were transported to Australia in 1834 for the crime of forming a trade union and swearing a mutual oath of loyalty to it. Wages for farm workers in Dorset had been declining for years, and the men, led by a Methodist lay preacher named George Lovelace, formed the Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers and swore an oath of loyalty to one another as members. The oath swearing was technically illegal under an obscure piece of legislation from 1797 that had been passed specifically to prevent naval mutinies and that nobody had thought to apply to farm workers before. The real reason for the prosecution, as was clear to most observers at the time, was that the landowners of Dorset were deeply alarmed by the idea of organised labour and wanted it suppressed before it spread. The sentences triggered a public response on a scale that surprised even the organisers. Around 800,000 people signed a petition demanding the men's release. A procession to present the petition to Parliament attracted enormous crowds through the streets of London. The 6 men were eventually pardoned in full and allowed to return to England in 1836 and 1837. The Tolpuddle Martyrs are considered the founding figures of the British trade union movement, and an annual festival in their village continues to this day. Fact number 54. A flogging remained a legally sanctioned punishment in British schools until 1987, when corporal punishment was finally banned in state-funded schools in England and Wales, making Britain one of the last countries in the developed world to remove this sanction from educational institutions. Independent schools, which are fee-paying and not state-funded, retained the right to use corporal punishment until 1999. A further 12 years of legal flogging in institutions attended by the children of the wealthiest families in the country. The standard instrument in English schools was the cane, applied either to the hand with the palm facing upward or to the clothed buttocks. In Scottish schools, the tawse, a leather strap split into 2 or more tails at one end, was the traditional implement. Birching, using a bundle of birch twigs, as was used in some institutions for particularly serious offences. Corporal punishment in prisons was retained until 1967. Judicial corporal punishment, administered by courts as a sentence rather than by institutions as an internal disciplinary measure, was retained until 1948, for most purposes, but survived in the Isle of Man, a Crown dependency with its own legal system, as a judicial sentence until 1976. The last judicial birching in the British Isles was carried out in the Isle of Man, making it one of the last places in Europe to retain this particular form of state violence against the body. Fact number 55. The Fleet Prison in London operated from the 12th century until its final closure in 1844 and served primarily as a debtor's prison for much of its later history. One of its more remarkable and thoroughly peculiar features was the system known as the Rules of the Fleet, under which prisoners who could pay a premium were permitted to live. Not within the prison itself, but in the surrounding neighbourhood, an area that extended roughly 1.5 miles from the prison gates. A prisoner who paid the required fees could essentially live in nearby lodgings, run a business, maintain a household, and live an almost normal life, while technically remaining in the legal custody of the prison. This arrangement was enormously profitable for the prison's management and enormously convenient for wealthy debtors who could afford it. But it illustrated with exceptional clarity how thoroughly money could modify the application of the law in this period. Fleet marriages were another extraordinary feature of the prison's history. The area surrounding the Fleet, including the prison's own chapel, became a notorious centre for clandestine marriages performed without banns, license, or parental consent, conducted by clergymen who were themselves imprisoned for various offences and who were supplementing their income with the fees these marriages commanded. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of such marriages were performed in the Fleet area between the 1690s and 1754, when the Marriage Act finally ended the practice. Fact number 56. The Highland Dress Act of 1746 made it illegal in Scotland for men and boys to wear the tartan, the kilt, the belted plaid, or any item of traditional Highland clothing, with the sole exception of those serving in the British military, for whom the clothing was considered useful and whose loyalty was considered purchased and therefore more reliable. The penalty for a first offence was 6 months' imprisonment. The penalty for a second offence was transportation for 7 years. The Act was part of a comprehensive programme of cultural suppression implemented after the Jacobite Rising of 1745 and the final defeat of the Jacobite forces at the Battle of Culloden in April 1746. This broader programme also included the Disarming Act, which prohibited Highland clans from bearing weapons, the abolition of the heritable jurisdictions that had given clan chiefs quasi-judicial power over their tenants, the suppression of the clan system as a form of social organisation, and the destruction of the economic and cultural patterns that had sustained Highland society for centuries. And the Dress Act was repealed in 1782, 36 years after its passage. By that time, the Highland way of life it had been intended to suppress had been largely dismantled through other means that did not require continued legislation to maintain. Fact number 57. The Jacobite Risings were a series of attempts by supporters of the exiled Stuart monarchy to reclaim the British throne from the Hanoverian dynasty that had taken it in 1714. The most significant rising, that of 1745, was led by Charles Edward Stuart, known to his supporters as Bonnie Prince Charlie and to his opponents by considerably less romantic titles. His army marched from Scotland as far south as Derby, reaching a point further into England than any Scottish army had penetrated in 2 centuries, before the decision to turn back was made, a decision that historians have debated ever since, without reaching consensus on whether it was military prudence or catastrophic miscalculation. The army retreated north and was decisively defeated at Culloden on April 16, 1746, in a battle that lasted roughly an hour. The reprisals that followed were ferocious. Jacobite soldiers, who had surrendered or had been wounded and could not flee, were killed on the field. Civilians in the Highlands, suspected of sympathy with the Rising, were killed, their homes burned, their cattle driven away. Prisoners were executed or transported. The Duke of Cumberland, who commanded the government forces and directed the reprisals, earned the permanent nickname Butcher Cumberland among those whose families bore the consequences. The romantic mythology of the 45 that developed in subsequent generations bears very little relationship to the suffering that Charles Edward Stuart's venture actually brought down on the people of the Highlands. Fact number 58. Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, for 19 years, before finally being executed at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587, after decades of political manoeuvring that had made her simultaneously a political problem Elizabeth could not solve and a human being whose situation Elizabeth found deeply uncomfortable. Mary had abdicated the Scottish throne under duress after a series of personal and political disasters, had fled to England, and had apparently expected her royal cousin to restore her to her throne. But Elizabeth instead kept her under a form of house arrest that moved between various noble houses with increasing levels of security as the years passed, and Mary became the focus of a succession of Catholic plots to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne in her place. Eventually, Elizabeth signed the death warrant after one plot too many, and the execution at Fotheringhay was gruesomely botched in ways that were unusual even by the imperfect standards of 16th century executions. The executioner struck 3 times with the axe before the head was fully severed. When he reached down to pick up the head to display it to the assembled witnesses, he found he was holding only a wig. Mary had shaved her head before the execution. Whether out of dignity or defiance, or simple, practical anticipation of an undignified end, it is impossible to know. A small dog was subsequently found hidden in the folds of her skirts, unwilling to leave its mistress. Fact number 59. The concept of quarantine as a public health measure derives from the medieval practice of isolating ships suspected of carrying plague before allowing them to dock and discharge their passengers and cargo into port cities. The word itself comes from the Italian for 40 days, which was the standard isolation period adopted by Venice from the 14th century onward and copied by other Mediterranean ports. English ports adopted similar practices from the 14th century and expanded them over subsequent centuries as it became clearer that infectious disease was commonly transported by sea. The problems with maritime quarantine were considerable. Ships full of entirely healthy people could be detained at anchor for 40 days in conditions that, with minimal provisions, limited fresh water, and close confinement in hot weather, would themselves create disease even where none had existed before they entered quarantine. The economic cost of quarantine was enormous. Every day, a ship sat at anchor, rather than discharging its cargo, was a day of commercial loss for merchants, shippers, and insurers. The pressure from commercial interest to shorten or waive quarantine was constant and in some cases effective. The tension between public health imperatives and commercial interests in the context of epidemic control is not, it turns out, a new problem or an unusual one. It has been a feature of responses to infectious disease for as long as those responses have existed. Fact number 60. The first vaccine was developed by the English physician Edward Jenner in Gloucestershire in 1796, in an experiment that worked, but that would by any modern ethical standard be considered utterly and unambiguously impermissible. Jenner had observed that milkmaids who contracted cowpox, a mild disease in humans, appeared thereafter to be immune to smallpox, one of the most deadly diseases in human history, and a disease that killed tens of millions of people across the centuries. He decided to test this observation experimentally. He inoculated an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps, the son of his gardener, with material taken from a cowpox lesion on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelmes. 6 weeks later, and after the boy had recovered from the mild cowpox infection, Jenner deliberately and intentionally exposed him to material taken from a smallpox lesion to test whether the cowpox had conferred immunity. James Phipps did not develop smallpox. The experiment was successful. Vaccination, which Jenner named from the Latin for cow, became one of the most significant medical advances in human history and has saved hundreds of millions of lives. James Phipps, the boy who made it possible by being used as a subject in an experiment he had no capacity to meaningfully consent to, received a rent-free cottage from Jenner for the remainder of his life as recognition of his contribution. Fact number 61. Yes, the British Navy operated on a foundation of press gangs for much of the 18th and early 19th centuries because it could not otherwise recruit and retain the number of sailors its global commitments required. Press gangs were groups of sailors and officers operating under the authority of warrants that permitted them to forcibly conscript men with seafaring experience into naval service against their will and without any legal process, hearing, or appeal mechanism. They targeted ports, rivers, and the areas around them where men with maritime skills could be found. Being pressed into service was not a mild inconvenience. It meant being removed from your life, your work, and your family without warning or preparation, potentially for years, with no ability to communicate your location to anyone who might be searching for you, and no mechanism for release other than the completion of your service, desertion, or death. Shipboard discipline in the Royal Navy of this period was severe by any standard. Flogging was routine. The Articles of War governing naval conduct prescribed death for a remarkable range of offences. Desertion, when caught, was punishable by death. The men pressed into service were expected to fight, to perform dangerous work, aloft in all weathers, to maintain a ship that the ocean was continuously trying to destroy, and to do all of this under conditions of authority that were effectively absolute and that they had had no voice in accepting. Fact number 62. Flogging in the Royal Navy was administered with an instrument called the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip consisting of 9 knotted or braided cords attached to a short rope handle, which left the skin broken and bleeding with the first few strokes and caused increasingly serious tissue damage as the number of strokes increased. The punishment was carried out formally and publicly, with the entire ship's crew assembled on deck to witness. The condemned man's wrists lashed to a grating or the ship's rigging in an exposed position, and the punishment administered by a boatswain's mate whose strength and willingness to lay on hard were part of the job's requirements. Sentences of 100 lashes were unremarkable in the records of the period. Sentences of 300 lashes are documented. A ship's surgeon was required by regulation to be present to assess whether the condemned man was fit enough to receive further punishment. But surgeons who were part of the same hierarchical and disciplinary culture that imposed the flogging were rarely inclined to intervene, except in cases of obvious and immediate danger to life. The skin was broken rapidly, scarring was permanent, and the public nature of the punishment meant that every man on the ship watched it happen and understood that it could happen to them for a range of offences that extended well beyond the most obvious and serious. Flogging in the Royal Navy was formally abolished as a routine peacetime punishment in 1879. Fact number 63. The swing riots of 1830 and 1831 were a widespread uprising of agricultural labourers in southern and eastern England that expressed the accumulated desperation of a rural workforce whose conditions had been deteriorating for decades. Low wages. The introduction of threshing machines that eliminated the winter employment of hand threshing, which had been a significant source of income for farm workers through the hungry months. The operation of the New Poor Law in ways that many communities found humiliating and inadequate, and the general misery of rural poverty in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars combined to produce a wave of unrest that surprised and alarmed the authorities by its scale and its geographical spread. The riots took their name from the fictional Captain Swing, in whose name threatening letters were sent to farmers, landowners, and parsons demanding higher wages and the removal of threshing machines. Threshing machines were destroyed across scores of counties. Hayricks were burned in the night. Toll houses were demolished. Workhouses were attacked. And the government response was rapid, extensive, and entirely devoid of any attempt to address the conditions that had caused the unrest. 19 men were hanged. Approximately 500 were transported to Australia. The threshing machines came back. The wages did not rise. The conditions in the countryside remained exactly as desperate as they had been before the uprising, and the people who had risked their lives to change them faced the consequences of having tried. Fact number 64. The charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava in October 1854, during the Crimean War, has been transformed by poetry and legend into one of the most celebrated acts of military heroism in British history. In military terms, it was an avoidable catastrophe caused by a breakdown of communication between commanders who disliked each other intensely and who failed to clarify an ambiguous order before acting on it. 673 men on horseback rode down a valley, flanked on three sides by Russian artillery that could fire into the column from multiple angles simultaneously. They charged for almost a mile and a quarter under continuous fire. 110 men were killed and 161 were wounded in approximately 25 minutes. The charge accomplished nothing of military value. The Russian guns were not taken. The position was not held. The men who survived rode back through the same fire they had charged through, as there was no other route available. The wider Crimean War, of which this was one episode, was characterized throughout by military mismanagement, logistical failure, and disease rates that killed far more men than Russian weapons did. The army's supply and medical systems were exposed as catastrophically inadequate for the demands of a major campaign, a fact that Florence Nightingale's work at Scutari documented with clinical precision and then publicized with extraordinary effectiveness. Fact number 65. The British involvement in the opium trade with China in the 19th century produced not one, but two wars: the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, in circumstances that revealed with unusual clarity the relationship between commercial interest and military power in the British Empire. Britain was importing enormous quantities of Chinese goods, principally tea, silk, and porcelain, and was running a serious and growing trade deficit because China had limited interest in British manufactured goods and insisted on payment in silver. The solution developed by the East India Company and accepted by the British government was to export opium grown in British India to China in exchange for the silver that could then be used to purchase Chinese goods. The opium trade was illegal under Chinese law. The Chinese government repeatedly protested it through diplomatic channels. When a Chinese official named Lin Zexu seized and destroyed 20,000 chests of British-owned opium and demanded that the trade cease, Britain went to war to secure compensation for the destroyed property and to establish treaty rights that would make future interference with the trade illegal under international agreement. Britain won. China was forced to pay an indemnity, cede Hong Kong, and open multiple ports to British trade. The right of British merchants to sell an addictive drug in Chinese territory was established and defended by military force for decades. Fact number 66. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people in Bengal, the eastern province of British India, at a time when Britain was fully occupied with fighting the Second World War, and the demands of the war effort were determining the priorities of imperial administration in ways that had lethal consequences for the Bengali civilian population. Unlike the major famines of the 19th century, the Bengal famine of 1943 was not primarily caused by crop failure. The harvest in 1942 had been reduced, but was not catastrophic. The famine was substantially caused and enormously worsened by a series of policy decisions, including the export of rice from Bengal for war supply purposes, the deliberate destruction of boats and rice stocks in coastal areas to deny them to a potential Japanese invasion that never came, the inflation of prices caused by military spending, the priority given to military supply over civilian food distribution, and the prolonged official denial that a famine was occurring, which delayed the activation of relief mechanisms that might have saved many lives. Winston Churchill's private statements about the famine, as documented in cabinet minutes and the accounts of officials present, expressed contempt for the Indian population rather than concern for the dying. He asked why Gandhi had not yet died. He referred to the famine as the fault of Indians for breeding like rabbits. These statements exist in the archival record and are not disputed by historians. Fact number 67. The Luddite movement of 1811 to 1816 has been thoroughly and unfairly misrepresented in common usage as simple opposition to technology and progress in general, a misrepresentation so complete that Luddite has become an insult, meaning someone who is irrationally hostile to anything new. The actual Luddites were highly skilled textile workers, framework knitters in Nottinghamshire, weavers in Yorkshire, and cotton weavers in Lancashire, and who were facing the destruction of their livelihoods by the introduction of machinery that allowed unskilled workers to produce cloth more cheaply and in greater quantities. Their response was to destroy the specific machines that were undercutting their wages and ending their occupations. They were not opposed to technology in general. They were opposed to the specific machinery that was being used to replace skilled workers with cheap, unskilled labor in ways that had no social safety net and left the displaced workers with no alternative income. The government's response was to make machine breaking a capital offense, to declare it equivalent to a criminal conspiracy, and to deploy military force on a scale that exceeded the forces simultaneously available to Wellington for his campaign in the Iberian Peninsula. 17 men were hanged at a single sitting at York in January 1813. The movement was suppressed, the machinery was reinstalled, and the workers it had displaced joined the swelling population of the destitute urban poor. Fact number 68. The Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 1921 and the British government's response to it included the deployment of a paramilitary force that became notorious across Ireland and internationally for violence against civilian populations. The force was assembled rapidly from veterans of the First World War seeking employment in a Britain that had promised returning soldiers a land fit for heroes and was struggling to provide it. They were sent to Ireland to reinforce the Royal Irish Constabulary against the Irish Republican Army's guerrilla campaign. Because proper RIC uniforms were not available in sufficient quantities, the recruits were issued mixed clothing, combining police and military elements, and the combination of khaki and dark police green prompted someone to nickname them after a famous pack of hunting dogs in County Tipperary. The name Black and Tans attached to them permanently. Reprisals against civilian communities became a defining feature of their operations. In December 1920, following an IRA ambush, Black and Tans and auxiliaries entered Cork City and burned a significant portion of the commercial centre. In November 1920, at a Gaelic football match at Croke Park in Dublin, troops opened fire on the crowd, killing 14 people. Many of the recruits were men deeply damaged by years of industrial warfare in France and Belgium, placed in a guerrilla conflict in Ireland with insufficient training, inadequate leaderships, and no clear boundaries on the conduct that would be permitted. Fact number 69. The Boer War from 1899 to 1902 saw the British military face a guerrilla campaign from Boer fighters in South Africa that its conventional military methods were completely unable to defeat, and the strategy it adopted to deal with this situation introduced to the modern world a practice that would be used by numerous regimes across the subsequent century, with results ranging from catastrophic to genocidal. Unable to bring the Boer guerrillas to a decisive conventional engagement because the guerrillas refused to fight that way, the British Army under Lord Kitchener adopted a scorched earth strategy. As Boer farmsteads that might provide food or shelter to fighters were burned. Livestock was killed or confiscated. Crops were destroyed. And the Boer civilian population, the women, children, and elderly men whose farm communities sustained the guerrilla campaign, were removed from the land and interned in camps that the British called concentration camps, a term they invented for this purpose. Conditions in the camps were catastrophically inadequate. Disease swept through overcrowded facilities with insufficient food, clean water, and medical provision. 28,000 Boer civilians died in the camps, approximately half of them children under 16. A further 14,000 black African civilians who were interned in separate and even worse facilities also died. Emily Hobhouse, a British woman who visited the camps and documented what she found, brought the scandal to public attention in Britain at considerable personal and professional cost. Fact number 70. Jack the Ripper committed a series of murders in the Whitechapel district of the East End of London in the autumn of 1888 that have generated more books, theories, investigations, and popular fascination than almost any other unsolved crime in history. At least 5 women were killed, all of them working as sex workers in the most deprived neighborhood of one of the world's wealthiest cities, and all were murdered with a specific combination of throat cutting and abdominal mutilation that suggested to police investigators at the time some degree of anatomical knowledge, though how much and of what kind has been debated ever since. The murders were never solved. The identity of the killer has never been definitively established. The fascination with Jack the Ripper across the century and a half since the murders has generated an entire commercial and cultural industry centered on the unsolved mystery of who the killer was. What is less frequently examined in the Ripper literature is the context of the murders, the fact that the women who were killed lived in conditions of desperate poverty in a city of extraordinary wealth, that they engaged in sex work as the only available means of paying for the most basic shelter, that they were vulnerable to violence as a regular feature of their lives long before they encountered the specific individual who killed them, and that their deaths drew attention and response that their lives in those conditions had never attracted. Fact number 71. The sinking of the RMS Titanic in April 1912 occurred during its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, when the ship struck an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland at around midnight and sank in approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes, killing over 1,500 of the 2,224 people aboard. While not exclusively a British story, the Titanic was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, was owned by the White Star Line under British corporate structure, and the casualty rates it produced reflected the British class system with almost mathematical precision. First-class passengers had a survival rate of approximately 62%. Second-class passengers survived at around 41%. Third-class passengers, as predominantly emigrants in the cheapest accommodation in the lower decks, survived at approximately 25%. There are documented accounts of gates between third-class areas and the upper decks being locked or blocked during the sinking, trapping steerage passengers below while their social superiors made their way to the lifeboats. The ship carried enough lifeboats for only about half its total complement, a shortcoming that was technically legal under regulations that had not kept pace with the dramatic increase in the size of ocean liners. The inquiries that followed on both sides of the Atlantic produced recommendations for improved safety that were implemented, as so many safety improvements are, after the deaths that demonstrated their necessity. Fact number 72. The legal status of women in Britain for most of its history is a subject that can be stated simply, but whose full implications take time to absorb. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman had no separate legal existence from her husband. She was legally subsumed into him. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not keep her own wages. She could not sue or be sued in court in her own name. She could not inherit property independently. She could not vote, obviously, but the absence of the vote was almost redundant given the more comprehensive legal non-existence that coverture already imposed. Any property she brought to the marriage became her husband's the moment the ceremony concluded. Any property she subsequently inherited became her husband's. If her husband was financially ruined, her property went with his. If her husband chose to gamble away the household income, she had no legal mechanism to prevent him. If her husband was violent, the law offered minimal protection and was administered by magistrates who were overwhelmingly male, who shared a general cultural understanding that domestic authority belonged to the husband, and who operated within a legal tradition that had been built by men for a world in which women's interests were considered only to the extent that they affected men's. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 began to dismantle this structure, but full legal equality in property rights took decades more to achieve. Fact number 73. The massacre of Glencoe in February 1692 was carried out in the Scottish Highlands by soldiers acting on orders from the Scottish Privy Council, which was acting with the knowledge of the English Secretary of State, and has remained in Scottish cultural memory for over 300 years as a symbol of betrayal and injustice that goes beyond its actual body count. The MacDonalds of Glencoe had been late in swearing an oath of loyalty to the new monarchs. William and Mary, missing the official deadline of January 1st, 1692, by a few days due to bad weather and the unavailability of the correct official to administer the oath. Administrative obstacles that a government sincerely wishing to accept the clan's loyalty would have treated as technical issues requiring accommodation. The government instead treated the missed deadline as a pretext for action against a clan that had been troublesome for political reasons unrelated to the immediate crisis. Soldiers were sent to Glencoe with letters of hospitality, standard documents requiring a community to house and feed soldiers. The MacDonalds housed the soldiers, fed them, and provided them shelter for 12 days. On the night of February 13th, in the early hours of the morning, the soldiers rose and killed their hosts. 38 men, women, and children were killed in the village. Approximately 40 more fled into the winter mountains and died of exposure. The violation of Highland hospitality, which required that guests be protected by their hosts, is the dimension of the massacre that made it most shocking to contemporaries. Fact number 74. The first women to vote in a British parliamentary election did so in December 1918, 10 years after the suffragette movement had reached its most intense period, and even then, only if they were over 30 years old and met a specific property qualification that excluded most working-class women entirely. The partial nature of the reform was not accidental. It reflected a political calculation that full equal suffrage would give women a majority in the electorate, because the deaths of young men in the First World War meant that women outnumbered men in the population. Rather than accept this demographic reality as a simple consequence of a war that had been fought and won, Parliament chose to construct the franchise in a way that artificially reduced women's electoral weight. Full equal voting rights for women, on exactly the same terms as men, did not come until the Representation of the People Act of 1928, a full decade after the partial reform. The suffragettes who had hunger-struck in prison and been force-fed through tubes inserted into their noses, who had smashed windows and set fire to postboxes and been imprisoned repeatedly for their campaign, were women in their 50s and 60s by the time the full reform they had been fighting for was achieved. The youngest of them had spent their entire adult lives waiting for a right that should not have required that kind of sacrifice to obtain. Fact number 75. The Bloody Code was the informal name given to English criminal law as it stood through much of the 18th and into the early 19th century. It is a legal system in which over 200 different offences carried the death penalty, including many that seem so minor by modern standards that the severity of the punishment appears almost incomprehensible. Shoplifting goods valued at more than 5 shillings was capital. Being found armed or disguised in a forest was capital. Damaging Westminster Bridge was capital. Cutting down a young tree in an orchard was capital. Impersonating a Chelsea pensioner was capital. Sending a threatening letter was capital. Escaping from lawful imprisonment was capital. The accumulation of capital offences through the 18th century reflected a legislature that was heavily composed of property-owning men, deeply concerned with the protection of property, and that responded to any perceived increase in crimes against property by adding the threat of death to the statute book. The practical consequence was paradoxical and somewhat humbling for anyone who believes that deterrence is an effective tool of criminal justice. Juries frequently refused to convict defendants for minor property offences because they were unwilling to send someone to the gallows for stealing a handkerchief or a loaf of bread. The law was softened in practice by human mercy at the jury stage in ways that made it less lethal than it appears on paper, but also less consistent, less predictable, and therefore arguably less effective as a deterrent than its architects intended. Fact number 76. And the Andover workhouse scandal revealed in 1845 that inmates were gnawing marrow from rotting animal bones because the master had been stealing their food rations. Parliament abolished the Poor Law Commission. The workhouse system itself continued. Fact number 77. Pentonville Prison required prisoners to wear brown hoods with eye slits whenever they left their cells so they could never see another inmate. Charles Dickens visited and called the regime more cruel than any physical torture. Many prisoners went genuinely mad. Fact number 78. The London Necropolis Railway, opened in 1854, transported corpses to a suburban cemetery with separate first-class and second-class carriages for the dead and separate stations for different religious denominations. The Victorians maintained class distinctions right through to burial. Fact number 79. Workers in British radium industries in the early 20th century were not warned their materials were lethal. Employers knew before the workers did. The bone cancers, jaw rot, and internal bleeding that followed killed workers who had no idea what was happening to their bodies. Fact number 80. The Franklin Expedition of 1845 sent 129 men into the Canadian Arctic and never heard from them again. Forensic analysis of remains found later showed lead poisoning, scurvy, starvation, and in the last camps, cut marks on human bones indicating cannibalism. Fact number 81. British child migration schemes sent approximately 100,000 children to Australia, Canada, and other Commonwealth destinations from the 1860s to 1970. Many told their parents were dead when they were not. Children arrived to find forced farm labour and institutional abuse. Britain apologised in 2010. Fact number 82. The Enclosure Acts removed from the rural poor the common land rights to grazing, fuel gathering, and foraging that had sustained them for generations, driving them into industrial cities where they became the desperate, landless labour force that the factory system required and that had no alternative to accepting its conditions. Fact number 83. The Elgin marbles were removed from the Parthenon in Athens between 1801 and 1812 by the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and sold to the British Museum. The Greek government has formally requested their return since the 1980s. The spaces designed for them in Athens remain empty. Fact number 84. The Profumo Affair of 1963 saw Britain's Secretary of State for War lie to Parliament about an affair with a woman simultaneously involved with a Soviet intelligence officer. When exposed, Profumo resigned. The associated prosecution of Stephen Ward was widely seen as a show trial. He died before the verdict. Fact number 85. The suppression of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya from 1952 to 1960 involved systematic torture of detainees in British-administered camps. Documents about the abuses were suppressed. When survivors brought a legal case in 2012, the Foreign Office was forced to acknowledge records it had previously denied existed. Fact number 86. Our British miners carried caged canaries because canaries die from carbon monoxide before the concentration becomes lethal to humans. Safety legislation after major mining disasters consistently followed the deaths rather than preventing them. The Hartley Colliery disaster of 1862 killed 204 people before legislation requiring 2 mine shafts was passed. Fact number 87. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 made sleeping rough a criminal offence, penalising the condition of homelessness rather than any act of harm to any person or property. It remained on the British statute books for 200 years. Parliament finally repealed it in England and Wales in 2024. Fact number 88. The Bristol riots of 1831 burned the Mansion House, the Bishop's Palace, and several prisons in response to parliamentary reform being blocked. The Reform Act of 1832 gave the vote to middle-class property owners. The working-class men who had rioted for reform received nothing from the legislation they had helped force through. Fact number 89. The Cato Street conspiracy of 1820 was infiltrated by a government agent throughout its planning. 5 men were hanged and then beheaded for the plot, the last time this sentence was carried out in English history. Their heads were displayed to a crowd that contemporary accounts describe as silent and visibly disturbed. Fact number 90. The Kindertransport of 1938 and 1939 brought 10,000 predominantly Jewish children from Nazi-controlled Europe to Britain, while the government did not extend the same rescue to their parents. And approximately 7,000 of those children never saw their parents again. Most of their parents were murdered in the Holocaust. Fact number 91. The contaminated blood scandal infected approximately 5,000 British haemophiliacs with hepatitis C and 1,200 with HIV through blood products in the 1970s and 1980s. Almost half have since died. The Infected Blood Inquiry found in 2024 that successive governments had covered up what had happened. Fact number 92. Thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant British women in the late 1950s as a morning sickness treatment and caused severe limb defects in approximately 2,000 British babies. The manufacturer was slow to withdraw the drug after evidence emerged. Legal battles over compensation for victims continued for years afterward. Fact number 93. The Dartmoor Massacre of April 1815 saw British guards open fire on American prisoners of war after the war had officially ended, killing 7 and wounding 60. A subsequent inquiry found the killings unjustified. Nobody was prosecuted. Dartmoor Prison remains in operation today on the same exposed moorland. Fact number 94. The Boer War concentration camps killed 28,000 Boer civilians, half of them children, through disease and starvation. Emily Hobhouse exposed the conditions at personal cost and was called that bloody woman by Lord Kitchener. A parliamentary inquiry eventually confirmed everything she had reported. Fact number 95. The Newgate Calendar transformed brutal criminals into popular legends for decades. Dick Turpin, who tortured elderly victims in their homes during robberies, became a romantic highwayman in fictional retellings. The distance between Crime as It Was and Crime as It Was, celebrated in popular culture, was very large then as it remains now. Fact number 96. Fleet marriages near the Fleet Prison allowed people to marry without bans, licenses, or parental consent, conducted by imprisoned clergymen for fees. Hundreds of thousands of such marriages were performed before the Marriage Act of 1753 ended the practice. The black market existed because the formal legal requirements excluded too many people. Fact number 97. Victorian reformers, including Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Fry, Annie Besant, and William Booth, looked at the conditions of British poverty and declared them unacceptable. The worst of what Britain did to its own poor was not done in ignorance. The alternatives were always there, visible to anyone who chose to look at them honestly. Fact number 98. The Bloody Code made over 200 offences capital in England, including cutting down a tree in an orchard. Juries regularly refused to convict for minor property crimes rather than send people to the gallows for theft. The severity of the law was softened by human mercy at the jury stage. which made the system unpredictable and unequal in its application. Fact number 99. The Gordon riots of 1780 paralysed London for 7 days and left large areas burning. The government hanged the ringleaders and addressed none of the underlying conditions. The ruling class privately held the memory of those 7 days for decades afterward as a private argument for cautious reform, rather than continued repression. Fact number 100. The Luddite movement of 1811 to 1816 was organized resistance by skilled textile workers to machinery, eliminating their livelihoods without any safety net, not irrational hostility to technology in general. The government deployed more troops against them than Wellington had in the Iberian Peninsula. 17 men were hanged at York in January 1813. Fact number 101. The last public hanging in Britain took place on the 26th of May, 1868, when Michael Barrett was hanged outside Newgate Prison. Private executions continued until 1964, when 2 men became the last people executed in Britain, and capital punishment for murder was abolished in 1969, ending a story that runs from the earliest days of British history to within living memory. From the plague pits of medieval London to the last public hanging outside Newgate in 1868, Britain's history is a long testament to human cruelty, resilience, and the slow, imperfect work of becoming better. These 101 facts are the parts of the story that your textbooks left out. Thank you for listening tonight, wherever in the world you are. Sleep well if you still can.